The crux of their achievement was the proclamation of Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, with General Emilio Aguinaldo as President and concurrent Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the First Philippine Republic. The Filipinos found themselves under foreign rule once more, this time under the Americans, who were decidedly at an advantage. Physically weak as the Filipino army was, it was morally strong, and it offered stiff resistance led by the famous revolutionary generals Emilio Aguinaldo, Gregorio del Pilar, Miguel Malvar, Antonio Luna, and the other brilliant strategists of that time. Thus, every battle against the Americans were classic in their own way and constitutes the best parts in Philippine history. With the establishment of the Commonwealth Republic in 1935, the country was set on a 10-year transition towards independence. Because of this, President Manuel L. Quezon conceived the idea of organizing a defense force that will secure the country's territorial integrity once it assumes self-government. The National Defense Act was signed and became the legal basis of the organization of an Army of the Philippines. On July 26, 1941, 5 years after its activation, the Philippine Army was merged with the Armed Forces of the United States. But early on December 8, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army under General Masaharu Homma attacked. Again, the barely trained Philippine Army was committed to the war front. In spite of the drawbacks they suffered, the gallantry displayed by our men side by side with American forces will be remembered. The Army went underground during the Japanese occupation and formed guerrilla units who fought the invaders through unconventional warfare. The defense of Bataan and Corregidor, as well as the infamous Death March, marked the heroism and courage of the country's defenders during World War II. A triumph of the Filipino spirit and a saga of patriotism. The tide of battle turned in favor of the Allied troops on October 20, 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur landed in Palo Leyte to fulfill his promise to return and liberate the Philippines. As a result, the Philippine Army was officially reconstituted at Tacloban on October 23, 1945. A revamp of the Army organizational setup was made. Training was stepped up, and a general activation was effected to ensure combat readiness and to prepare the Army for its independence under American rule. Barely a year later, on July 4, 1946, the country won its independence. The late 40s and the early 50s saw another turning point in history as the danger of dissidents and insidious forces became imminent, posing grave danger to national security and eroding democratic foundations of a nation now being reborn. Again, the Filipino had to go to war, this time against communism. Thus was launched the anti-dissident campaign against the Hukbulahap. To cope with the situation, 7 Army sector commands and 26 battalion combat teams were organized and deployed to the trouble-stricken areas in central Luzon. Yet, while the Republic was waging war at home, the Army had to respond to the call of freedom in other shores. An international commitment in Korea as a member of the United Nations. 5 battalion combat teams took turns in rendering service with a PEFTOC from 1950 to 1953. Here, the splendid performance of our officers and men who fought side by side with the soldiers of other nations proved once more their mettle and endurance in the battlefield. The 60s saw the Philippine Army sending civic action forces to the war-torn country of Vietnam, another manifestation of its commitment in preserving peace and harmony in the whole world. Medical and dental teams, engineers, rural community development teams, and security personnel proved their expertise in civic action and other humanitarian endeavors. At home, the military's role was expanded to include participation in the socio-economic development programs of the country. Home defense centers were established, reservist training was emphasized, and 2 engineer brigades were organized to give impetus to the government's construction projects. As the command's role gained momentum, it was again reorganized on February 1, 1970. The military areas were deactivated, and the infantry divisions and infantry brigades separate took their places. The later part of the 60s saw a ferment on the rise. Subversion again reared its ugly head, resulting in chaos and meaningless destruction of property and bloodshed. A state of anarchy prevailed. Lawless elements already emboldened by the turn of events were set to wage a full armed insurrection and rebellion against the Filipino government in order to forcibly seize political and state power of the country and overthrow the duly constituted government. With this situation, Proclamation 1081 was declared on September 21, 1972. With the nation faced by challenges posed by communist-inspired insurgency in Luzon and the Visayas, and the Muslim secessionist movement in the south, a buildup of forces was implemented, utilizing the Kamagong concept of organizing infantry battalions for deployment to critical areas in the south. This situation prompted the Army to immediately and directly confront the rebel groups to restore peace and order throughout the country, accelerate development programs as proof of the government's sincerity to uplift the condition of the Muslim masses and attract dissidents to the folds of the law. The 4-day People Power Revolution at EDSA on February 22 to 25, 1986 was a turning point for the Philippine Army. It is again the time to push for more needed reforms in the organization. The years within 1986 to 1996 were the most dramatic ones in Philippine modern history. During this climactic period, the Philippine Army leadership was resolute to form a new army, more readily responsive to its mission sovereignty of the country was threatened by the unabated growth of the MNLF, MILF, and CPP-NPA-NDF forces, and the emergence of the ultra-rightist groups, which continued to gather strength over the years. It is for this reason that various campaigns were carefully planned and launched against the enemies. The most noteworthy of these campaigns, which enabled the Army to retain the upper hand and unceasing control over the situation, were the Special Operations Teams and the Army Concerns on Community Organizing and Development. The SOT, which was proven to be very successful, is an Army strategy composed of intelligence, civil military operations, and tactical combat operations designed to dismantle the communist political infrastructure in the barangay level and extinguish its mass-based support. As a counterinsurgency weapon, it sought to unite and mobilize the Filipino people to collectively check the political and armed expansion of the CPP-NPA-NDF, particularly in the countryside. The Accord, on the other hand, was envisioned to preserve the gains of counterinsurgency operations, organize or strengthen community-based organizations, encourage individual and collective human capability in community building, and educate, train, organize, and develop communities as participants in social development. During the Ramos term, the peace agreement finally became a reality in some parts of Mindanao. Exploratory talks, formal negotiations, series of consultations workshops, mixed committee meetings, and peace and development summits revolved to establish the special zone of peace and development in the areas with the SPCPD as its implementing mechanics. For the Army, the full implementation of the SPCPD signifies a spark to the end of the decades-old armed confrontation with their Muslim brothers. With the cessation of violence in the region, the Army can now concentrate in addressing external threats, which calls for more sophisticated foreign policy and improved international relations, and in doing its share in nation building through deeper socio-civic involvement. And finally, Filipino soldiers, whether Christian or Muslims, will be fighting side by side for the sake of only one cause. The stabilization of the peace and order situation in former venues of conflict provides the impetus for the dramatic transformation of the AFP's role as it took on another dimension when it was called upon to actively participate in nation building. The Philippine Army, for its part, set into motion its direct involvement in countryside development by calling on the men in uniform to commit their resources to national and local government initiatives toward peace and development, specifically in empowering various communities and its people to be effective participants in nation building. In response to LOI 4294, the AFP campaign plan Unlad Bayan, the command created an implementing plan labeled as Gintung Nayon, which emphasizes the coordination of military forces with civic and sectoral organizations for the attainment of developmental goals. It also intensified its civic action programs to complement the programs of various government agencies. Numerous medical and dental civic action programs are conducted to benefit the majority of the people, particularly in the depressed areas. Likewise, soldier teachers are deployed in critical and depressed barangays through the Army Literacy Patrol System, which provides basic education to people in the far-flung areas in support of the Education for All program of the Department of Education, Culture and Sports. The Philippine The men and women of the Philippine Army constitutes a superb fighting force that has proven its gallantry time and again against foreign aggressors and the enemies of the state. They are a conglomerate of talented, highly trained, and measure for measure, the equal of the best minds. because among their ranks are engineers, writers, physicians, historians, managers, and people of diverse talents whose capabilities are now being challenged by the rapid and often bewildering developments of the coming millennium. 100 years ago, a band of discontented patriots established the first Philippine Army at the Tejeros Convention in Cavite Province. They and those who followed them would prove times without number how willingly they would pay the ultimate sacrifice. Now,
anibersaryo ng pagkatatag ng hukbong katihan ng Pilipinas, ako ay nagpupugay sa mga pinuno, kawal at kawaling sibilyan ng pangunahing sanghay ng sandatahang lakas. Sa makahulugang pagdiriwang na ito, binibigyang diin ang ating maringal na kasaysayan na siyang naging simula ng ating kontemporaryong hukbo at ng hukbo para sa ika-21 siglo. Buo ang aking paniniwala na sa darating na hinaharap, ang hukbong katihan ay magiging makabago. Isang hukbo na magpapaagapay sa atin sa iba't ibang modernong hukbo sa daigdig. Isang hukbo na may kapabilidad, profesional at malakas na puwersa. Tunay na angkop ang tema ng kasalukuyang anibersaryo na 100 taong kaakibat sa kapayapaan at kaunlaran, sapagkat ang hukbong katihan ay marami na ring landas na tinahak upang maisulong ang kanyang mga mithiin. Maligayang bati at mabuhay tayong lahat.